Afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Program, it's my privilege to welcome you all to our FASTER meeting this afternoon. Those of you that don't know me, I'm Bob Chaddock from the National Science Foundation. The aspect of the FASTER community, as some of you may be already aware, basically is unique in the federal context in the sense that it sits astride the interests of the operational elements of federal information technology. The FASTER activity is co-sponsored by the Federal Science Council. It's also in the context of a NIDARD-sponsored research program where the aspirations are basically encourage the communication of the interests of requirements and the opportunities research to inform priorities within government. And one of the things in that today is really the sense of being able to welcome and to introduce a presentation from the Center for Technology and Government at the University of Albany. It really, from my perspective, is a world-class activity in the areas at the intersection of government and technology, of access to data, government process, and technology. So in that respect, it's a true model and a very good contribution in our FASTER context. The other thing I'll share with you is, and this is a sense of, for those of you that may have been around the NIDARD program for a while, what you also will recognize is that a few years back, the Center for Technology and Government was a very active and valued contributor to the FASTER program. You know, in the context of activities that involve the Collaborative Expedition Series, things that even contributed to the development of this NIDARD activity. The CTG was a very active early contributor. So in some respects, it's my privilege to welcome Dr. Theresa Pardo to join us this afternoon to share with us some of the good things that are happening and the great developments in Albany, but also, Theresa, to also welcome you back in the sense of being able to provide us an update of what's been happening in the last few years as well. So with that, it's my privilege, Dr. Theresa Pardo.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you to everybody who's involved in the program for bringing me back here. I hope I can live up to the performance, if you will, of Sharon Dawes, who is the founding director of the Center for Technology and Government and actually now works with us still at CTG as a faculty fellow. So I have an agenda today that looks something like this. My interest is, or my agenda is to introduce to you CTG and to kind of provide a bit of an update to some of those of you who are in the room who actually have some knowledge of the work that CTG has been doing over the years. And then I want to talk a little bit about the way that we do our work and how we pay attention to context, stakeholders, and co-production, how we think about the creation of public value as a process of co-production, and that involves stakeholders. It involves the process of deeply understanding or developing deep understanding of context as a way to create an interactive process, looking at the technology, looking at the governmental arena in terms of policy, in terms of management, and sort of moving back and forth in a very iterative way to refine how we understand those particular interaction spaces and how we have to act to maximize the potential value of any particular technology investment or investment in policy or an investment in new management practices. So I'm going to talk very briefly about some methodological tools that we use in this space to kind of maximize that interaction opportunity. And then I'll talk for basically the second half of the presentation about our work in opening government and opening government data, and in particular as an example of the kind of context, stakeholders, and co-production process. I'll talk about the use of or the creation of a public value framework through again, a co-production model, and the application of that public value framework to the creation of an open government public value assessment tool. That work in particular was carried out with the White House Open Government Working Group, and then refined with many other government partners, both here in the U.S. and other countries in the world. And so I'll kind of capstone the end of this with a couple of ideas that I think really sort of very specifically represent the CTG frame of reference, a frame of reference that we would encourage you to consider in the work that you do, that you, as you think about how to co-produce technologies that will sustain, will be adopted, will be taken up in the government agencies that you are affiliated with, part of, et cetera. So with that being said, so that's where we'll start. A couple of ideas more generally. First, the Center for Technology and Government thinks about this perspective all the time, right? Technology advances, nothing new here, changing the way the world operates. We think about technology and the way we see the world around us, understanding little things like websites, but open data websites in the city of Moscow. Bloomberg thinking about how technology will change the economic development opportunities in the city of New York. This particular woman who is sitting on the side of the street in one of the poorest cities of India, and being able to change the way she lives her life every day, because now, instead of walking 3 miles to determine if there is piecework available in the factory, she can now use a basic cell phone to find out if there is, in fact, work to be done. And if the answer is no, she can stay put with her children, her grandchildren. Or if there is work to do, then she can get a sitter and get the job done. We have students now in places like CTG and around the world, I'm sure, trying to understand in very specific ways, how does access to a cell phone change the life of this particular woman? And in particular, I have a student who did his dissertation on studying the information use behaviors of this very specific community of women, and how access to these cell phones have changed the way, literally on a day-to-day basis, decision by decision, they now operate their lives in different ways. So this is an example of the kind of deep context knowledge that we think at CTG is very important. What we also know is that not only this lovely woman in India who's been able to change her life, but the government leaders all over the world are turning to technology as drivers for government transformation in ways that we've been hoping for a very long time, and now we're starting to realize. Certainly President Obama calling for folks to make change, the G8, which has now put in place an open data charter to focus on or increase transparency in their mind to fuel innovation. What we don't know very much about yet is to what extent does open data fuel innovation? What is the nature of that innovation? How can we ensure that the way that data gets opened does in fact fuel that kind of innovation? And so those are some of the research questions also that are on the horizon. A visit from the delegation of Kenya, or what's called Kenya's Devolution Authority, the folks responsible for implementing the new constitution, for making sure that all the assets and liabilities that need to be transferred around the new forms of government in the country of Kenya, so that they can be successful releasing or implementing their new constitution, at its basic level requires effective information sharing and integration. They had this idea. They thought it was possible. They didn't fully understand what kind of technology innovations, policy and practice innovations would be necessary to actually capture and share information that was required for the devolution process to in fact be shared. And subsequently, they've had lots of follow-on problems from that. Information technology decisions among the most complex that governments are making. We understand that plan change can, in fact, make a difference here. So what does plan change look like within the context of ICT innovation? I like to think first about innovation. What is innovation? Lots of folks in this room know the answer to this question. Just put it out here for the purposes of discussion. The generation, acceptance, implementation of new ideas, new processes, new products, new services. It's not always the creation of a new idea, but to lots of government organizations, innovation is adoption or adaptation. We need to understand what that looks like. So in our work at CTG, we think a lot about innovation and risk. Our work is very much focused on the innovation characteristics and the organizational characteristics, and trying to reduce uncertainty by fully understanding those individual characteristics and then how they interact. The more we know about those interactions, the more risk we can identify, the more risk we can manage. And so the vision that we have and that we pursue is using various tools and techniques and methodologies to understand the characteristics of innovation, understand the characteristics of the particular organizations, the context, if you will, and use that knowledge to reduce uncertainty. Lots of risk associated with IT innovation in the public sector, again, probably very well known by the folks in this room, both literally and virtually. We have to think about public sector innovation as quite unique and understand the forces that make that more complex or differently complex, if you will, than the private sector. Regardless of the sector, the organizational factors, the alignment, support, acceptance, the work-associated risks of innovation. We spend a lot of time in our work getting people to really understand what it is that they're doing on a day-to-day basis so that we can begin to more specifically unpack what's possible in terms of innovating in those individual spaces. Certainly the risk of too much technology hope, we see that in a lot of our leadership. A lot of what we're trying to do both here in the U.S. and around the world is to develop new capability at executive levels to be circumspect, if you will, a new appreciation for circumspection about what's actually possible in terms of adoption of new technologies and policies and practices in any specific context or any specific period of time. Helping folks not to be anti-innovation and change, but to do so in a well-informed way, essentially planned change. Know what's possible, know what's doable, and by possible I also include how can new capability be created that's missing. In many environments, we take on new technological or practice innovations without fully appreciating what capabilities are required to be successful in that regard. So a lot of our work is about trying to understand what capabilities are required to use a particular technology within a particular context, what capabilities are required to create the new policy frameworks, the new management models, and then how can we create that capability so that the innovation can, in fact, be successful. We use this a lot to help the folks that we work with understand the challenges that they're facing. So we see public policies changing with intent in most cases in a relatively slow pace. Technology obviously changing much more quickly in the organizations that we all serve as a part of in the public sector, that we're responsible for. What is the nature of that change? What is the pace of that change, and how do we reconcile these differences? What's known about these interactions, whether it's from a research perspective, from a practice perspective? How do we really embrace these interactions and these differences, unpack them so that we can provide guidance to overcome them? So the Center for Technology and Government was created 20 years ago by Mario Cuomo, who was then governor of the state of New York, who was beginning to recognize that a lot of the challenges, a lot of the uncertainty about the risk that was being created by a lack of knowledge and understanding about the characteristics of the technology and the characteristics of the state of New York at that time was limited. He began to say, let's solve this problem. He's a very action-oriented governor. And in his State of the State address in 1993, he said, let's create a non-governmental entity responsible for exploring new applications of technology to the practical problems of the public sector. And so he was very much responding to pressure from state government officials, from their partners in academia, from the private sector who said, this isn't working. It's just not working anymore. It's not working for any of us. So we need a new model. We need to find a space where we can experiment. We can understand the ways that technology can positively impact. We can't afford the huge failures that we've been experiencing. Everybody's losing face, so let's do something proactive about it. And so 20 years later, the Center for Technology and Government has been operating against this agenda, trying to improve public service delivery through better understanding of what it takes to be successful in information technology innovation in the public sector, looking at government efficiency, not just service delivery, but also internally to the practices and the procedures that are carried out within the government agencies themselves. So our agenda, improve public service delivery, government efficiency. We do that through an agenda focused on knowledge creation, information dissemination, and capacity building. Our focus is, through this partnership model, government, university, and business coming together in the projects that we carry out, focusing on these three rings, but at the intersection of the rings on policy, management, and technology. How do we understand the policy context? How do we understand management? How do we understand the technology context? And a good example, again, going back to the Kenya example, who is really, as a country, making great advances in terms of the use of technology and the creation of a public policy framework, created an information sharing policy for the work that they were doing in devolution. Unfortunately, what they didn't fully appreciate was the need for an execution strategy. How would the sharing actually occur once the policy was put in place and the policy was adopted? Folks knew about the policy, but the execution strategy had not been designed and implemented. And again, that's a question of understanding what's necessary to make real change in the organizational context as it relates or responding to a new policy framework. And so our interest in CTG is to focus on creating new knowledge about those interactions. The way we do our work is through this very specific model of research practice partnerships. Because of where we were, because of our charter, if you will, when Governor Cuomo created us, he created us in a unique way to focus on these very specific problems being experienced or opportunities being explored in the governmental context. And so we work very closely in the work that we do by bringing together the experts from practice with the academic skill and knowledge of the folks from the academic community, many of the professional research scientists from government agencies as well. Our goal is to create new knowledge through these projects and also to create improvements in practice. So just a little bit of detail that I can probably skip over most of this, but the most important part of this particular slide and of the comment here is that very early on in our history, 1995, 2 years after we were created, the Center for Technology and Government was recognized as an Innovations in American Government by the Ford Foundation. So by 1995, the model that the center was pursuing, looking at this intersection of policy management and technology and doing it through public, university, and industry partnerships, was already identified as novel and supported in this way. And this is quite important for us because what it allowed us to do for the first time, for the first 2 years we were created, we were focused on the state of New York. Governor Cuomo created us, he funded us. We were charged, if you will, to work very closely with New York State government agencies. The Ford Foundation Award allowed us to begin to look around at the other possibilities for applying the model that had been created in New York. And so we brought together for the first time a global community, a group of scholars and practitioners from around the world who shared a perspective, the socio-technical perspective, who understood that we need to pay attention to the intersection of policy management and technology. And so again, the center works has 4 interconnected components that make it work. The most important is a staff mix that includes deep experience and practice. So several of us come from practice backgrounds. Before we became academics, that helps us a lot in terms of understanding organizations and how they work. We have technical expertise, well-developed research and communication skills. We were very lucky, I suppose, that when we were created, shortly after we created, the web became a viable dissemination strategy. And so very quickly we were able to gain a foothold, if you will, in the global communication market. The institutional arrangement that allows us to link across academia, government, the private sector, again, very, very critical. When we were first created, we were created as a miscellaneous appropriation in the New York State budget. We had no institutional home, if you will. The first year, we were located at the University at Albany. Subsequent years, we moved inside of the University at Albany once there was a change in the party in the governor's office. Everybody thought it might be a good idea if we kind of ducked for a little cover inside of the university. And since then, we're a university-wide research center that works with government and industry quite closely, but allows us to also take advantage, if you will, of the university context by having colleagues from the university. We now have many of us appointments at the university. We have grad students and undergraduate students, international education organizations are part of our network as well. And so again, getting back to the outreach mechanisms are very, very critical to how we do what we do for a couple of reasons. A, it lets us get the word out about the work that we've done, and so much of our agenda is focused on information dissemination. But it also allows us to engage a wider range of government partners in exploring the kind of critical questions that we're interested in. For example, the deployment of social media in government agencies. One of the things that we were talking to our government colleagues about is what's missing. Everybody's talking about social media. What are the challenges that you're facing in government agencies trying to actually embrace the opportunities afforded to us all by social media to do, for example, new programs focused on reaching out to youth at risk, for example. So what's the best way to get out to connect up with a youth at risk? Well, I think the dominant response to that is social media. But a lot of state agencies, New York and many others, it turned out, have no policies associated with the use of social media technology. And so we were able to use our outreach strategies, our outreach mechanisms to engage a wide audience of government professionals who were struggling with this question. And very many, we discovered, had actually implemented social media-based strategies using their own personal social media tools, social media accounts. And they were using those accounts to actually carry out their responsibilities as government program officers because they couldn't get through the social media policy vacuum that was existing in their environments. And so being able to reach out to folks who are wrestling with the kind of critical questions that matter at this point in time. How do we take a technology that provides tremendous new opportunity for us to think about or change the way government operates and ensure that we have in place the mechanisms that are necessary to actually leverage that technology. And so the CTG team, again, getting back to a bit of the story about how the center is structured, we're quite small given the agenda or the portfolio that we carry out. And we're able to carry out that portfolio in large part because of the partners and the collaborators that we work with around the world. And as it says here, we're very happy with the engagement from the students. We've got lots of retired professionals knocking at the door. This slide was created a while ago, but we've got a number of government professionals who are seeking the opportunity to come back to a place like CTG, and I would imagine others, if they were available, to be able to apply their knowledge and experience, understanding of the context to the goal of reducing the risk associated with innovation. Some of the partners that we've worked with are sort of identified here, just to give you a sense of the global reach of the center. Certainly NSF, which has been a wonderful supporter of CTGs over the years, but also places like the United Nations, the World Bank, Nigeria, Kenya, Microsoft, the GSA, the Library of Congress should be on here, but doesn't appear to be, EPA, and many others. 20 years by the numbers. The 20 years have been good to us. I think it's very important to just kind of show this this infographic, which gives you a sense of the support. I guess maybe it gives some support for the comment that Bob made about the center, which is that we are recognized as a global leader in this space. 25 dissertations out of the work we've done over the 20 years. I think that's a wonderful number. Like to see it grow over the next 20 years, but it's a good number. I own one of those, so I'm pretty happy with the number itself. Equally important, the center has informed the development of a government information strategy and management concentration at the Public Administration and Policy program at the University at Albany. That program, designed by myself and Sharon Dawes and a couple of other folks, uses the perspective that I've kind of introduced here, which is that innovation in IT in the public sector, in order to be successful, really requires a deep understanding of this interaction space. And so what we teach our students, who are MPA students and doctoral students in public administration, we teach them how to think about technology in the public sector and what are the kinds of tools and techniques they can use to help their colleagues, government leaders in the agencies they work with, do a better job making decisions about the kinds of technology strategies that A, make sense, and B, are likely to be successful. If they're not likely to be successful with existing resources, what needs to be created in terms of capability and opportunity for success to be theirs. And that program is actually #3 in the nation right now in terms of information strategy and management concentrations in the public administration programs ranked by U.S. News and World Report. So I think these are two very important indicators of the work that the center has done. Another important indicator is 70 projects. And so why 70 projects is important and 309 partners is because it provides evidence of the take-up, if you will, of this model, this way of working, how the partnership products that have produced the guidance documents, the new models and methods that are informing government technology practices around the world come out of these projects. The partners come from across the world, and we're very pleased to see the citation count for the work that's happening at CTG continue to rise. Increasingly so, there's a recognition that we need to build the skills, the tools and techniques to understand this interaction space among these three ideas: policy, management, technology. Very briefly, the center, I just want some recent projects at the Center for Technology and Government we're involved in. We're running the New York State's broadband speed test for the state. We help them kind of figure out how to do that, and also helping them create a deeper understanding of the status of broadband across the state's community anchor institutions, and how are people thinking about and adopting broadband. What implications does the adoption of broadband have, or the nature of the reaction to broadband adoption have in terms of economic development? And so we're about to start a new piece of work to be able to track broadband adoption to specific economic development activities within specific industry categories across the state. Increasingly important initiative in the state of New York, understanding the potential of broadband and working more closely with providers so that the providers are willing to go into typically underserved areas, helping them understand how can they maximize the investments that they're making in their broadband networks if, in fact, they're going into typically underserved spaces. And so it's kind of a complex problem that we're trying to work with them on. Another area of work is in the area of smart city service integration. As many of you probably know, the cities, the world's population is moving to the city, and we're trying to understand what are the implications of that. There are many, many researchers around the world who are working with practitioners to understand the various nuances of this problem. One of our areas of work is shared services. We're in the process of working with 2 new teams on energy harvesting and urban agriculture and helping them begin to build new capability for co-production. How do we get the government officials and the energy harvesting research scientists in the room together early on and often so that the research can be informed by the kinds of issues facing policymakers and government decision makers? And so we're beginning, we led the formation of a global consortium on smart cities research. We have now about 17 teams from 17 different cities around the world who are working with this framework to guide our comparative work. And our interest is to find out what are the characteristics of individual cities that influence the outcome of particular technology-based innovations, and how can we help cities do a better job picking those strategies that are most likely to work within their particular situation. What works in Philadelphia may not work in New York, probably won't work in Shanghai. How will it work in Mexico City? But we have cities all over the world who are pursuing strategies that are in fact picked up and dropped down in other cities. And so we're trying to help reduce the risk associated with adaptation, which is part of the innovation process, but needs to be done in a very well-informed way. Information sharing networks to support consumer choice projects. Again, this is another piece of work that we're focused on that is much more traditionally research-oriented, but what we're trying to find out is how to, or what we're trying to do is build a data architecture that supports the capture and sharing of certification and inspection information so that consumers, at the point of consumer choice, have very, very detailed information associated with that particular product. Every step of the supply chain, data is captured about certification and inspection. Every product, every piece of that product has different kind of certification and inspection requirements. How can we capture that data and move it along in a way that makes it easily consumable and usable by the consumer? And so it's an interesting project actually supported by the Interop program here. Information sharing and coordination and financial market regulation. A major challenge facing government agencies all over the world is sharing information from place A to place B. Many of you, I'm sure, in this room understand that very well. It's generally understood that the lack of capability to share information across the boundaries of government organizations contributed to the economic crisis, the economic downturn, and so we're to the crisis. And so we are working with a group of government officials, financial service industry professionals, and academics to try to understand what are the challenges what are the challenges to information sharing and coordination in financial market regulation? How can we understand those challenges, reduce the effect of those challenges through additional research activities that are necessary to make a difference? And so you might be surprised, we had this workshop a couple months ago in November here in DC. The 3 issues that were identified by this group, they were very specifically tasked to have a socio-technical perspective, and the 3 themes that that emerged from their conversations about challenges were standards, incentives, and trust. I know, shocking, right? Earth-shattering. But these are the challenges. So creating standards that are multi-sector, multi-organizational, that make it possible for data to flow through the system in the way that we all imagine it should, creating the incentives in this kind of environment that result in the creation and use of those standards, the sharing of information when in fact it might be counter to their organizational imperative or model. So how do we manage this environment when we now know the significance of a lack of adherence or a lack of attention to these kinds of issues really has quite global significance? And one last one, I think. Yes, finally. The Center for Technology and Government is also working with support of the Institute for Museum and Library Services on a project focused on identifying the role of public libraries in open government ecosystems. one of the things that we know is happening in the world of open government is that individuals who are seeking to become more informed, more empowered, more interested, taking action to engage in the open government process are turning to their libraries. They're turning to the libraries for help accessing data. They're turning to their libraries for understanding the opportunities that are available to them. But libraries are not necessarily resourced or prepared for this new role. And so IMLS had asked us to bring together a group of professionals from across the library systems, across the civil society organizations who are paying attention to these kinds of questions, and to begin to understand what might the new role of public libraries be when we think about the library as part of an open government ecosystem. What are the skills and responsibilities of librarians going forward, who are in fact now becoming information or intermediaries in a new way. We've always had them as intermediaries, but now they have one more job. And how do they understand that job? How do we understand that role? And so overall, what role can libraries play in this new environment? And so this sort of high-level overview of the work that's going on at CTG, there's many more projects that are underway, but I wanted to give you a sense of some of the activities. Our 201, looking at issues associated with context, stakeholders, and co-production. The IMLS project as an example, bringing together this community of folks to co-produce a white paper that is now being used as the foundation of the workshop. What are the research questions that need to be answered? What are the frameworks that we could create that would help not the cutting-edge libraries necessarily, but all the libraries begin to understand in a new way what the possibilities are, and then carry those out. So I want to go back to an important piece of work also that Bob kind of tipped his hat to, which is this particular piece of work that was done in 1999. And at that time, we were just beginning to understand digital government and what it might mean. We're just beginning to understand, as Mario Cuomo did, that the challenges associated with IT innovation aren't only technical, and we need to understand in a new way what are the challenges and how might we pursue or create an agenda against those challenges. So the result of this workshop, funded, I believe, by NSF, to try to understand the problems of a digital government, produce these two statements, many others, and I'd encourage you to take a look at this kind of historical view of a digital government in the 21st century. But it was at this workshop where the statement, what is technically possible may not be organizationally feasible or politically or socially desirable. Again, probably not the first time a statement that had that same essence was made, but in a very important one that helped lay the foundation for the digital government program here at the NSF, and for an entire community of scholars worldwide that are paying attention to these kinds of questions. Advanced IT applications in government must integrate policies, processes, and information technology. And so again, laid the foundation for the creation of a society, of a community of scholars that work with these ideas in mind. We also work with this particular image in mind, the layers of complexity, trying to understand how policy and program and economic context interact with the organizational settings and very much the inter-organizational settings that most of our governments, our government agencies are operating in. Understanding in great detail the work processes and practices. Who knows what about how things get done is a very surprising question to ask. Right? So we think very often that the way work gets done is actually the way it's written in the book. The way work gets done is actually by the way the boss says the work gets done. And we know in our work it's never in the book and it's never the boss. We ought to find somebody who actually does the work, carries it out, understands the issues, and get those captured and modeled, And once we have those things modeled, we can begin to layer in the other, to add in the other layers of complexity that will ultimately influence whether the particular adaptation of a technology or an emerging technology is likely to be successful. And so in our work at CTG, we put the tools, and I mean that, the technical tools, emerging technologies, old, new technologies right in the center, and we get to that pretty much last. We know that there's a particular technological innovation that the organization is beginning to consider, but we look at that opportunity through the lenses of the policy program context, the organizational, interorganizational challenges. For example, information sharing in the justice community requires interorganizational capability. We have to be able to work across the boundaries of organizations, and how that works is very complex. Two projects funded by NSF to the Center for Technology and Government have produced new models of the socio-technical aspects of information sharing across governmental entities. So we've done a lot of work in that space, and that work continues to drive practice both here in the U.S. And in other places around the world. In fact, we use that information sharing models that were produced as we've been working with Kenya and Nigeria and Mexico. So these are really very, very critical models that are now available that help governments both here and elsewhere understand the kinds of complexity, the kinds of capability that are required to actually succeed. So the next few slides tell you a little bit about some of the methodologies. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on any of them, but I think it's important to put these ideas out in front of you, this notion of sustained interactivity as a way, as a frame of reference, if you will, for our research practice partnerships. There's quite a long-standing recognition of the need to create this kind of sustained interactivity before, during, and after a research project. The best way, as it says here, to assure that the research is relevant and is understood and used by practitioners. How do we get practitioners to actually engage with the research scientists? How do we get the research scientists to engage with practitioners in a way that produces value? So action research is one of the ways we do this. If you've heard of this before, it's pretty straightforward. The methodologies are designed very specifically to include practitioners in the research process. There's also prototyping. We do a lot of this at CTG, and we tend to do comprehensive prototyping, which allows us to take the technical prototyping and create it within a context that is like the ultimate use environment. It takes into account managerial, institutional, environmental factors, for example. And so, if you will, we did a prototype of a data sharing. Back in the day, we called them data warehouses. So it was a data warehouse that would support assessments of the impact of homeless services in the state of New York. We spent a lot of money on homeless services. The folks had this, who ran that program had the idea that they wanted to understand the impact of the programs and services, and we began to build the prototype and take a look at the institutional and organizational context. And one of the things that was very interesting to find is that in the Human Services, or in the Bureau of Shelter Services in the state of New York, there was no definition of services. So they wanted to assess the impact of services, but it took many, many months to actually come up with a definition of what a service is. Across the homeless provider agencies, across the state, the county entities, looking up to the feds, what's a service? So that actually took considerably longer than building the fundamental elements of the system. And so it began to recognize that what the recommendations that were put forward to the agency were spend a couple of years building the foundation around standards and policies and procedures associated with a statewide approach to homeless services, and then build a technology that will, in fact, allow for you to do what you want to do. But right now, your problem isn't that you don't have a system. The problem is you don't have a larger framework that is common. Context matters. We care a lot about context. I've said this a couple of times, but these tools and techniques allow us to take context into account when we do the work that we do. That is why the partnerships with the public sector professionals, the experts in their programs, are so important to the work that we do. Living labs, folks I'm sure have heard of the idea of living labs. Again, another model for doing this kind of work. It's very much focused on getting stakeholders and their views incorporated into the policy process. But it also, as I've said up to this point, it greases the skids, if you will, with respect to take up. So a lot of these ideas were at the foundation of the formation of CTG. Many of them have been refined over the years, both through the work that we do and the work that we do, the opportunity we had to work with others who share these perspectives, that it's very important to create the conditions in which you can unpack the complexity associated with innovation in any particular context, understand the characteristics of those environments, and understand the influence that those characteristics have on the potential of that innovation to realize the impact that you believe it will have. And so when we talk about opening government data and public value creation, the Center for Technology and Government was very interested in these ideas when the directive was released from President Obama, but we've also been interested in them for many, many years. Our first non-New York State funded project was from the National Historic Publication and Records Commission that funded us to create an electronic records access program design. So back then, we called it electronic records access, but essentially it was they wanted from us a tool to help government agencies design programs that would make records held by those agencies and organizations easily available to users outside of the agency. And so we spent a lot of time in the late 90s and early O's thinking about users and uses and context, and beginning to really refine our appreciation for the fact that the release of data required, if in fact we wanted to create a very specific kind of public value, it required a very specific kind of consideration. Who are the potential users? What is their capability to actually consume a raw data release? What must the government agency invest in beyond the raw data release to ensure that the value that's possible is in fact created? So what does that look like, and how does a government agency actually unpack that problem and inform their own decision making? So the OGD, I won't go through this. You all, I'm sure, are familiar with this. But it set out a set of principles, a process, and a set of responsibilities, which I think were quite new. It directed folks in the agencies and the departments to take very specific actions to implement against a set of principles. They were required to do very specific things: publish, improve, create new policies, create culture. And there was a central mandate, which was not really political transparency per se, but focused on opening data. So the job was get the data out there, meet this directive. And so a lot of that was done. It was done quite nicely. And there were some agencies that were doing it so well that they were recognized as leaders. And so the U.S. Department of Transportation, for example, was recognized as the exemplar for the federal government. And I think they did a great job, and not just because we helped them use to do their planning with our PVAT tool. I think they were pretty much on their way before. At this time, we were working with the General Services Administration and talking to practitioners both within the federal environment and in other places around the world that had already begun to respond to the directive. And they were asking these kinds of questions. They knew that they were going to do something. They had to. The directive said, you must do X, Y, and Z. You must publish. You must release. What they didn't know is which things mattered more. How do I pick? What should I do to create the most value? And so we began to work with this community of practitioners to respond to help them create new tools to respond to these kinds of questions. And so the needs that they identified were that they didn't have the insight that was necessary about the relative value of one strategy versus another, and they didn't have tools to help them create that insight. And so the project began to take a look at these kinds of questions. How can we create value through the open data programs that we are now pursuing? And the questions were important to pay attention to because of the ideals of open government and because of the investment that the agencies were going to be making in these new projects. Lots of folks were spending lots of money, lots of time, and they were very visible. What we began to do is apply a tool a framework that we had produced under previous work called our public value framework. And this concept is built off the idea that public value is social, that it has that the value of is in terms of individual and group interests. There is no absolute value. It's not going to save us $100 million. It in fact might increase the quality of life for 10 stakeholders according to these three dimensions. Very different kind of a measure. Seldom have there been full agreement about how to assess value across the communities or jurisdictions. Not a lot of understanding about good ways of doing that, but it still needs to be done. Individual interests matter here, and how they link to institutional and governmental reforms matter. And so we didn't have tools to help us pay attention to those issues. So how the government sees, or how the citizens see the government matters a lot in the public value framework. How we think about that relationship, how we think about public value in terms of the government, the foundations of our government matter, how people see government, where they come from matter. So the government, the Constitution has a particular form of value. The UN Charter promotes a different kind of value, social progress, better standards of life. The EU Constitution, yet another perspective on public value. So how do we think about the question of public value within the context of the open government agenda? How do we think about and create the insight that the government practitioners were seeking as a way to support the kinds of decisions that they needed to be making? Not insignificant decisions related to non-insignificant investments. And so we began to talk with them about using this concept of public value, the idea that there's essentially two major kinds of public value: benefits that accrue directly to persons or group. The use of this website that allowed me to get my permit reduced my wait time by X number of minutes, X number of days. All right? There's a thing that benefits me directly. I now know something that I didn't know before, and I can act more efficiently, more effectively in my own life. The value to the public that results from improving government as a public asset. The government is now better able to secure the homeland. It is better able to eradicate infectious diseases. Assessing public value or public returns is really framed by stakeholder interests. And I think this is where the critical conversation with the working group took a turn, helping them to begin to build understanding of these different stakes for different stakeholders and how we need to understand these different perspectives as we seek to explore the public value proposition in opening government data. The public value framework was a great tool here because it allowed for this kind of expansion of the investment rationale beyond cheaper, right? Cheaper, faster, better is the traditional model. Return on investment models that give us a bottom line. Right? These are not particularly relevant in the government context. Several years ago, before this project, SAP funded a thought leadership project at CTG that was responding to pressures from governments around the world, frustration with traditional return on investment models. And so the public value framework was a response to the lack of fit, if you will, between traditional return on investment models and public sector IT investment initiatives having to do with the creation of public value, this idea of intrinsic value or enablement. And so understanding as part of this process stakeholder interests and how value can be created for different stakeholders became very critical, and then the transfer of that knowledge to the White House Open Government Working Group and others was critical as a way to build this model, to refine the model, and then begin to use it. And so the components of public value are these. We have this expanded value proposition beyond economic or sort of the bottom line, if you will. Analysis of new kinds of value types, analysis of value generators. What creates the value that we care about, that we seek to accrue? And then how do we apply these tools and techniques? So just very quickly, the public value proposition, this is in one of the guides and in a number of the academic articles we've written about this. But the traditional return on investment model looks at this. It looks at the IT investment, it looks at internal agency returns, takes into account the cost, the business goal, the private costs. The public value proposition, the public value framework allows for a broader consideration of the value types and of the value potential of any particular initiative. And so this model that you see here is, in fact, the way we think about the public value of opening data. And this is the model that seems to be resonating with many folks worldwide as we seek to make an argument for or support the argument that opening government data actually does produce value. If we are going to make those claims, we need tools like this to help us unpack those statements and be very clear about the nature of the value that's being created. It also then requires us, or allows us in some cases, to actually unpack that even further, reverse engineering upstream and understanding why does a particular, or under what conditions does a particular opening data initiative create value, and under what conditions is it likely to fail and not produce the value that we imagine possible. And so the public value framework and the assessment tool was seeking to respond to this kind of a question posed by the government officials who worked on the development of this tool with us. Does our open government portfolio, taken as a whole, optimize our resources and our capabilities and maximize public value for all stakeholders? And so the question that they began to consider is, what is their portfolio? How does the portfolio respond to the individual stakeholders that I've identified? And do they, in fact, have the capability to deliver on the portfolio that they had imagined for themselves? What we also discovered, as you may have as well, is that for most of the government agencies who were working on these kinds of initiatives, the expectations for creating new kinds of public value through an open government portfolio were quite unfamiliar to them. And so taking that into account as part of the larger context of the open government agenda was quite important. And then the responsibilities that were being assumed, again, goes back to our need to pay attention to context and capability as we think about value creation and innovation. How do we need to understand the nature of the particular innovation, the nature of the particular opportunity, and then take that into account when making decisions about what will happen in the short, the medium, and the long term. Very often, the short-term kinds of initiatives, we call them low-hanging fruit. We can do them because we're capable of doing them. Very often, we think about the long-term initiatives, but the long-term capability or the long-term innovations often don't get supported by short-term investments in capability. So if we really want to do that thing, we can't do it now. What do we have to do between now and then? And how do we continue to revisit the investments that are being made to create that new capability? Stakeholder interests are important here. Very quickly, we know stakeholders care about efficiency, they care about effectiveness, they care about intrinsic enhancements to the environment in which they live in. But in our understanding of open government, stakeholders also care about transparency, participation, and collaboration. And this is the thing we worked really hard with the government, our government colleagues. Where do you put transparency, collaboration, and participation in a public value framework that's going to be thinking about open government? Are we trying to produce transparency as the outcome? Is transparency the value creation, or is transparency a mechanism? We decided, as a group, that transparency, collaboration, and participation are actually mechanisms to create new kinds of value, quality of life, intrinsic, and you'll see them as they come up. I know them like the back of my hand, except for now. Right, so transparency, collaboration, and participation are actually interests that stakeholders have, and if we focus on those interests, we can seek to create these kinds of public value types: strategic, quality of life, social value, political value, ideological value, and stewardship value. These are the kinds of things that stakeholders are interested in producing. How do we make investments in open government initiatives, understand what it takes to be successful carrying those initiatives out, and understand which stakeholders will benefit in which ways, and then undertake an agenda to ensure that those stakeholders realize that potential. So the CTG public value logic model is very straightforward. The government seeks to take an action. We want to understand what changes for each stakeholder. How does the life of that or the experience of that stakeholder change? What's the impact and the value for those stakeholders? And then if we look across all of the stakeholders and the value types, are we in fact maximizing the potential of our investments? In many cases, we talk to agencies, and they do this analysis, they look at their portfolio, and they say, everything we're doing is all about stakeholder X. We didn't realize that every initiative that we have undertaken is about creating value of this type for that stakeholder. Maybe it's time to spread the wealth or share the wealth a bit. And so there's an important new opportunity here to understand in a very nuanced and specific way who are the stakeholders associated with a particular initiative, in this case, opening government data. What is it that they care about? What are their interests? How do we create those interests? And then how do we use our understanding of those interests and opportunities to make choices about what matters more and what we should do next? And so public value planning, when we think about this in terms of the open government data context, it allows us to understand what data sets bring the most public value. What's the balance of public value brought by the data sets that are released? So what is the mix of a portfolio? What are we thinking about? What's the mix of stakeholders we're serving? What types of value are most prominent based on the data we release? So if the portfolio analysis allows us to understand if in fact the kind of data releases that we're engaging in, whether it's a particular type of data or a particular release model in the sense that it is a straight release with no particular value add in terms of visualizations or other kinds of additions to the data itself, what makes the most difference for the people that we're seeking to serve? So the PVAT is an online toolkit that's used by government agencies through a group decision process. It was used by the U.S. Department of Transportation, as I said. If you read their report, you'll see where the PVAT was used by them to help them come to consensus about the potential of the individual initiatives that were being considered by the agency, and then to make choices from among those initiatives in terms of what they wanted to be known for with respect to their open government and open data portfolio. We're also using the tools inside the state of New York and in Nigeria and other places around the world. We have some countries or governments that have gotten in touch with us and said, that's really great, I love the public value framework, not going to use it, or not going to use the open government assessment toolkit, but I love the public value framework, so those 7 public value types are now going to be required reading for every IT government professional, and any future proposal they make for an IT investment has to be characterized in terms of those public value types. So different people are taking away from this process different pieces to make a difference in the work they did. Our view of this is it enhances stakeholder analysis. It allows the organization to anticipate issues of conflict, complexity, to plan for growth and demand, to identify synergy with other programs. But it's really hard. It's quite hard. It takes a long time, and that is the case because it is a group process. We need to hear what people think about the potential of a particular initiative to create a particular value type, and to compare their perspectives and opinions on these ideas. It can get a bit more rigorous. It's quite rigorous, but it can get a bit more specific than I'm making it seem. But in fact, it does take quite a long time because we're thinking about accounting versus evaluation versus social science. We have different frames of reference that we bring into the room. It's always easier to look back than look forward, so we're asking people to anticipate what they believe will happen, and then across the models that people are used to, there's relatively little consistency. So the public value framework is an example of the kind of research to practice translation process that CTG has been built on, and that we continue to invest in the refinement of. And so I want to end today with just a few ideas that I think kind of characterize the work that we do, characterize the kinds of work, the kinds of ideas that I would like, as I said earlier, for you to consider in the work that you have responsibility for. And so one of them is going back to this digital government research agenda, which is essentially calling, again, the question that what's technically possible may not be the kind of thing that we want to do, and we need to understand the political and social, the political feasibility and the social desirability of these kinds of efforts. To make smart IT choices, we need to focus on policy, management, and technology, and at the intersection of these three institutional, organizational mechanisms. We need to pay attention to sustained interactivity as part of the take-up process, closing the gap, if you will, between research and practice in really in serious and specific ways. What does that look like within different contexts? How do we create that capability, knowledge, and skill to actually produce this co-production space that we all recognize is so critical? Coming back to research-practice partnerships, understanding, again, that it's a little harder to do than sending out a survey. A little harder to do. We think it has more value. Surveys are part of this process, potentially, but the co-production, the engagement, that's necessary to, for example, define a survey that could be used to outline a new theory frame that is recognized as necessary by both research and practice partners. The layers of complexity. This is a really critical part of the work that we do, trying to understand how these layers interact, how we think about them, and how we unpack the complexity associated with ideas or innovations that live at each one of these layers. And then ultimately, the reality of the context, which is that change is happening all the time, happening at very different paces. Our individual ability to take into account all of these change elements is limited. It's really critical for us to bring together interdisciplinary teams, experts in all kinds of areas that are able to come together and look at a picture like this and understand fully the implications as a group. So thank you very much.